know what happened last Tuesday night, and now we're going to talk about why. Joining me, Bethany Blankley, a conservative political activist. Thanks for joining us on What America Thinks. Olivier Knox, the White House correspondent for Yahoo News. Glad to have you with us. And Bernard Whitman, the author of 52 Reasons to Vote for Barack Obama. Welcome to all of you. Olivier, I want to start with you. What are you hearing about these issues in terms of the gender gap or the generation gap or the ethnic gap from Republicans these days?
You know the old song that Eskimos have 100 words for snow? The Obama campaign has 500 for "We told you so." They're coming out and they're saying this is a big victory for their analytical wing, for the people who harvest and then interpret data about voters coast to coast, and target those voters without those voters ever really knowing that they're actually being targeted by a political campaign. They're thrilled. As I said, there is an element of "I told you so." They said, look, we predicted this breakdown. We predicted the racial makeup, the age makeup. We told you that the battleground polls were in our favor. We told you that our internal polling reflected that. They're happy, but there's not that real relief because they're telling us basically, well, we called this.
Now, Bethany, the polls, some of the initiative results suggest that maybe Republicans are running against the tide of history on social issues or perhaps on this more diverse America. Is that what caused problems for Mitt Romney?
I think what caused problems for Mitt Romney was more, in the beginning, he had trouble defining who he was and telling the story about what makes him most relatable to voters. And what I think this election came down to was really a popularity contest. People didn't care about the fact that we have a really bad economy. They don't care that unemployment was 7.9% or even higher if you're looking at other figures. But they cared more on who was more likable. And you know, Barack Obama seemed to, all the polls showed over 50% of people saying that he relates more to my struggles, or he relates more to who I am.
That also was something the Obama campaign latched on to earlier. Now, Bernard, you're obviously a happy man today, but in the polling, in the exit polls, we saw that half of Americans still want to repeal the health care law, 2/3 want to cut spending. Was this more a victory of personality rather than substance?
Absolutely not. It's a victory for the president's vision of shared prosperity, shared contribution, and shared equality. So what the electorate basically said was, we buy into this notion that everybody should contribute, everybody benefits, and everybody should be treated equally under the law. That's why we saw the president's vision for the economy approved nationwide. That's why we saw 4 out of 4 victories for the freedom to marry in key states approved. And I think it really shows that the Democratic Party put out a vision of America coming together, and the Republican Party was held hostage by the Tea Party, who wants to keep things going backwards rather than going forwards. And actually, I think the Tea Party, the seeds of the destruction of the Republican Party, came out of the win in 2010. I think the Tea Party ultimately doomed chances for the Senate takeover and doomed chances for a proper Republican to come out and position himself to win, or herself to win, the presidency against Obama.
Olivier, do you buy what Bernard's saying about this positive vision being ratified?
Well, you know, you put your finger at it a little bit earlier. The Obama campaign knew that the economy was going to be the millstone around its neck. And they set about telling a story, and that story is, you know, you may think, polls show this, you may think that Mitt Romney maybe is the more qualified guy to oversee the economy, but you know in your heart that the guy who's out for you, who's out for your interest, is Barack Obama. And they hammered Mitt Romney from the end of the primaries, when he came out broke and couldn't spend again until after the convention. They hammered him from the end of the primary to the conventions, telling that story very compellingly. Romney folks said it would narrow, that disadvantage would narrow, that it would break along partisan lines. Well, that turned out to be broadly true nationally, but it didn't need to be true nationally. It needed to be true in places like Wisconsin. It needed to be true especially in places like Ohio. And in Ohio, where the president could point to the auto bailout as a specific act that he championed, that Mitt Romney opposed, he got an enormous advantage. On the Tea Party question, there's no doubt that terrible candidate selection doomed the Republican effort to retake the Senate. You know, I was saying before the show, if you wake up in the morning and your spouse says, hey, the rape comment guy lost, and your answer is, which one? You have a problem with your candidate selection. And the Republicans today are saying, I mean, I don't know what they're saying to John Cornyn, who was in charge of recruiting these guys, but I can tell you what they're saying about him, and they're not very happy.
Okay, now let me ask you one more question, though. Your comments seem to suggest maybe that the Obama team was just better at this game than the Romney team.
I think they were. I mean, when you look at one of the most important and interesting arcs here is what happened to the 2007-2008 Obama campaign. It elected him. It quickly turned into essentially the lobbying arm, the grassroots lobbying arm of his administration. And then it morphed back into his campaign when he announced formally in April of last year. It never went away. It kept up contacts with voters every single day. They had neighborhood captains. They had this vast micro-targeting effort. And just to be clear, that's basically when they look at your background, your church attendance, what you subscribe to, where you shop, 500 different data points, and they can figure out pretty much how you're going to vote and whether you're going to vote. So they had this vast micro-targeting advantage over the Romney folks. And the Romney folks basically never really caught up. And they made, in some ways, I think, though we'd have to look at the polling data as it comes out more and more, I think they made the same mistake that John Kerry made in 2004, which is counting on outside money to make up for what a campaign ought to be doing.
Okay. Now, Bethany, when you're hearing all of this, I mean, is this just a bleak time for the Republican Party? Where do you go from here as a party, not as a nation in the governing sense right now, but what's going to happen to the Republicans?
Well, I think we have a lot of super conservative stars or superstars like Marco Rubio, Bobby Jindal, Susana Martinez, Nikki Haley. There are a lot of upcoming leaders, I think, that will encourage the base and encourage conservatism within the party. I don't think that it's dead. You know, there are some aspects of change that need to happen.
Yeah, so you're looking to the governors rather than Washington people primarily, from what it sounds like. Sometimes when you're a parent, you have to separate your kids. Sometimes you just throw them into the room until they can figure things out for themselves. Well, in the last 3 election cycles, voters threw the kids out. This time, they threw them all back in the room. A Republican House, an even more Democratic Senate, and President Obama. And they're basically saying, you guys have created a mess. Clean it up. Bethany, how is that going to work?
Not very well, I don't think.
What can we expect?
Well, President Obama hasn't actually worked well with Congress in the past. He's had more executive orders than any other president in my lifetime, going around Congress to impose law, which is just disrespectful for the way that our government works. Also, I think that what Republicans have been saying over and over again is that we can't afford the spending that's being proposed by the Democrats. We can't afford Obamacare. We don't have over $600 billion that it's going to cost. So I think that we'll see some stalemates. I'm not quite sure how much bipartisanship is going to work.
That's a bleak start. Now, Bernard, part of the problem, and this goes to both parties, is that a plurality of voters think President Obama ran a negative campaign. They think Mitt Romney ran a negative campaign. President Obama basically said we shouldn't go back to the Bush years. Mitt Romney said we shouldn't go back to the first Obama term. Most voters agree with both of them. They didn't hear anything positive. How do you govern like that?
I'm actually optimistic, and here's why. The president now does not have another election to fight for, so he's fighting for his legacy. The Republicans realize that their stonewalling in an effort to diselect Obama didn't work, so they actually have a reason to compromise as well. I actually think that we're going to be able to make significant movement on immigration reform, on getting a deal with respect to deficit reduction, revenue increases, reform of the tax code, because at the end of the day, I think this is going to come, the compromise, not out of political expediency, as it did for Bill Clinton in '95 in the wake of that election, but out of necessity for the country. We have got to deal with these critical issues, and I think both parties actually have a reason to do so.
Olivier, maybe immigration reform could move along in a bipartisan manner, but when you hear about making significant impact on the deficit, has either party prepared voters for this?
You know, the Obama's day after election message was basically Americans should now set aside their partisan differences and do what I want. It's a classic message from presidents who, after they win electoral victories. I'm not a particularly optimistic person. I covered Congress the last couple of years, and I got to tell you, I didn't see anything there that gave me a lot, made me very sanguine about compromise. But look, yes, immigration reform potentially. Education reform, potentially, because that's an area that Republican House Speaker John Boehner feels pretty strongly about, and it's an area where the White House thinks it could triangulate between the teachers' unions and the Republicans and come out with a win, a bipartisan win. In a matter of weeks, we face the fiscal cliff, that combination of tax increases and spending cuts, the end of unemployment benefits. that could trigger a fresh recession. I don't think any side really wants that to happen. I do think the president's hand's a little stronger now. You know, he's got more liberals in the Senate. He got reelected, and he's got the bully pulpit again. You know, and he lost that a little bit before the campaign after the 2010 election. So I'm not very optimistic about a deal, but I can sort of see the outlines of one maybe emerging.
Is there any chance there's going to be serious talk about entitlement reform, though, about reducing the military spending, any of these other big budget items that are really the reason for our deficit?
I think that there are two warring factions in terms of the future of this country, and two very different visions for how to rule in terms of, do we have less government, more government? And unless there are going to be significant compromises, I'm not optimistic on that front.
Bernard, why are you so optimistic
Well,
still?
because, frankly, it's going to be incumbent on the Republican Party to remake itself. Their vision failed. It was rejected by the voters. They've got to come up with something else. Intransigence as a strategy does not work. They're going to have to move on some of these issues. And I think that with health care off the table, Obamacare is a fact of life now. It is not going away. So we need to move into things like deficit reduction, mixing of defense cuts, other spending cuts, revenue increases. Boehner said today, or a few days ago, that he would accept some spending increases if entitlement reform was on the table. So I think you dangle that, see where it goes, and I actually think we will be able to make some movement on these key issues because, for the sake of the nation, we have to.
Okay, but now, Olivier, polling does show that if voters thought there were real spending cuts, they might be willing to kick in a little bit extra in taxes. But they got to believe the spending cuts are real, and that's the rub. Nobody thinks Congress is serious about that. Do you think anybody in Washington has the credibility, the legitimacy to broker that deal? Not within Congress, but with the American people.
Oh, that's a really good question. You know, I don't think that the president handled a Democratic majority Congress all that well, and he certainly didn't handle a divided Congress all that well in the last couple of years. But the person I'm most looking at, it's not one of the outside wise men. It's actually Jack Lew, the White House Chief of Staff, who has experience in the political knife fights of the 1990s. He has experience dealing with a divided Congress, has experience dealing with Republicans, and has a lot of experience dealing with fiscal issues. I'm going to watch really carefully what role he plays, because I think that if there's a solution here, he's going to be a big part of it.
Okay. And what's your biggest surprise from the night?
The fact that we actually went 4 for 4 in the referendum on marriage equality. I think it's a huge step forward for the nation.
Yours, Bethany?
Just the lack of people that came out to vote for the Republican seniors and
white voters. Okay, yeah. Olivier.
If you'd told me that they would have the call, or they would call the election shortly after 11 p.m., I would have laughed in your face.
The absolute best thing about the election was that it did end on Tuesday night. We didn't go through a long recount. We're not stuck in that limbo.
Hear, hear.
All right.